Good morning. It's time for us to get started. If you can make your way to a seat. We are in 2 Corinthians here on Sunday morning. We have today and then two more classes to wrap up quite a bit of the remainder of the book. We're going to be looking at chapters 8 and 9 today and chapters 10 through 12 next week. Those are each units. 8 and 9 are one section. Chapters 10 through 12 are one section. In the final week, we'll kind of do some summary and look at a very important lesson found in chapter 12 as Paul sums up his letter and everything that is in the future for the Corinthian church. So that's the game plan for the last 3 weeks. And today, like I said, we're going to look at chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 7, which we really kind of went through very quickly last week, because we've referred to chapter 7 quite a bit in the class. It is an important part of the idea of comfort, which Paul spends a great deal of time on in chapter 1. And then in chapter 7, we see a real life example of the comfort of God that he is describing in chapter 1 as he describes the comfort that both he and Titus had received by the actions of the Corinthian church. Paul had written them a very severe letter, and they had taken that letter to heart and had responded with a godly sorrow. And if you look over in chapter 7, he says, and we're going to begin in verse 9, because this is in some ways a transition to what we're going to talk about this morning. He says, I now rejoice that you were made sorrowful. Not that you were made sorrowful, but that you were made sorrowful to the point of repentance. For you were made sorrowful according to the will of God, so that you might not suffer loss in anything through us. For the sorrow that is according to the will of God produces a repentance without regret, leading to salvation. But the sorrow of the world produces death. Now, obviously, there are a lot of lessons in that we're just skipping over. But I hope that any class like this should just be you're getting off point. You're getting off the bus to study this book as a result of this class. And there's so much in this book that we aren't taking the time to go through. But here he talks about their reaction to his teaching, to his letter, in which he admonished them about a certain matter. And then he talks about that reaction beginning in verse 11. He says, for behold, what earnestness this very thing, this godly sorrow has produced in you. What vindication of yourselves, what indignation, what fear, what longing, what zeal, what avenging of wrong. In everything you demonstrated yourselves to be innocent in the matter. Now, you would have to go back early in this letter where Paul is talking about this situation that he had written the severe letter regarding. At the time we talked about that, we said, when you go back to 1 Corinthians, Paul obviously writes about the person who was engaged in an incestuous relationship, and the church had not dealt with that, and he's encouraging them to deal with that. And some people then get to this letter when Paul refers to the one who was restored, that refers to the one who was restored, and it's the thought sometimes is, well, he's talking about that situation that he wrote out about in 1 Corinthians. I think this section shows us that that's not the case, because he's clearly talking about a situation where there is one who offended and one who was offended. And he talks about that situation here. So there was another situation, and Paul says, you have responded in the right way. And he refers to this earnestness. The word earnest is going to come up in this section of the letter. We're going to come back to that later in the class. But this is kind of the beginning of it. He says, what earnestness this very thing, this godly sorrow has produced. And then he says, What vindication of yourselves? You have shown yourself. You have vindicated yourself in this matter by your godly sorrow and your reaction to the situation. What indignation and fear and longing and zeal and avenging of wrong, their handling of the matter. And everything you demonstrated yourselves to be innocent. He says, so although I wrote to you, it was not for the sake of the offender, nor for the sake of the one offended, but that your earnestness, here's that word again, that your earnestness on our behalf might be made known to you in the sight of God. For this reason, we have been comforted. So when we come to, so remember those things, we're going to come back to that, but that is kind of the transition of chapter 7 that Paul is making into the matters of chapter 8 and 9, which is this matter of the collection for the needy saints in Jerusalem. So when we come to chapter 8, Paul is going to encourage them to complete this work. If you look back over to 1 Corinthians 16, which we covered a year ago around this time, in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, Paul had written to them, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collections be made when I come. Now, this is in reference to a physical need of many of the saints in Judea. The Christians in the area of Jerusalem and Judea, where the gospel had sprang forth, these Greek churches are now going to make a collection and send it back. And Paul is going to all the churches and explaining the situation and making arrangements for how they're to collect it and how they're to do all that. And he also says here, he goes on to say, when I arrive, whomever you may approve, I will send them with letters to carry your gifts to Jerusalem. And if it is fitting for me to go also, they will go with me. So here's the situation. You're to set aside each Sunday, you're to set aside for this work so that the money is gathered so that when I come, there's no need to scurry about getting ready for this. It'll be ready to go. And then he says, and I want you to elect someone from amongst yourselves to be an administrator of this, to go with this money. Now I think multiple churches are gathering this money. So at the time that all of this is gathered and they're now going to Jerusalem, this is going to be a large sum of money. And he says, I'm instructing each church to delegate someone to represent you in carrying this money to Jerusalem. So now, approximately a year later, according to what Paul says here in chapter 8, he is revisiting this subject and is saying, it is now time to complete that work. And he begins chapter 8 with an illustration from the churches of Macedonia. Now, who were the churches of Macedonia? There should be at least one that comes to your mind. Yeah, Thessalonica, Philippi, well-known churches from the New Testament standpoint, and there are others. But the church, and we can read, and you can read in the letter Paul wrote to the Philippian church, you can read that he mentions their generosity and he's thankful for them. In fact, it is the Philippian church primarily that has supported him financially when he worked in Corinth for 18 months. All right? If you'll remember back in Acts chapter 18, we talked about the fact that Timothy had arrived and that Paul then devoted himself full time to the work. Well, why is that? Because money had come from Macedonia through Timothy to support Paul in the work there. So Paul now goes back to these Macedonian churches, these great churches of that period, no doubtedly well known, spoken of repeatedly. And he says in chapter 8 and verse 1, now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God which was given in the churches of Macedonia, that in a great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. For I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave on their accord, begging us with much urgency for the favor of participation in the support of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. So we urge Titus that as he had previously made a beginning, so he would also complete in you this gracious work as well. Now, Paul will say later in this chapter, he says in verse 10, I give my opinion in this matter, for this is to your advantage, who were the first to begin a year ago, not only to do this, but also to desire to do this. So in other words, this whole effort of collecting this money to take to Judea for the people in need in Judea, this whole effort had begun with the church at Corinth. They were the first to begin they were the first to express a desire, he says, to do this. In fact, we read in chapter 9 that Paul had boasted of their desire and of their effort to the other churches so that other churches were inspired to engage in this work of benevolence because of what they had heard the Corinthian church was doing. That's in chapter 9 in the first two verses. So Paul is saying, look, you started work on this a year ago. And now these other churches have done this and have completed this work. And I want you to look at their example as they had looked at your example earlier. I want you to look at their example now and be encouraged to complete this work. In other words, the time has come and men are coming to you. The men who would bring this letter to them that he talks about in chapter 8, they're coming to you to make sure that you have completed this work so that we can continue on to Judea with this money. But I want you to notice what Paul says about the church of Macedonia, the churches of Macedonia. He says that in great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. He is not describing the church at Corinth there. The church at Corinth was wealthy. That doesn't mean that there wasn't anyone in Corinth, in the church at Corinth, who wasn't wealthy. But by comparison, Corinth was one of the wealthiest cities in the world at the time. And no doubt that many of the Christians there engaged in commerce and other things were quite wealthy. Matter of fact, there's plenty of indication that there were very wealthy people in the church at Corinth. And he doesn't really describe Corinth as a church suffering affliction. Why? Because Corinth's whole problem was that they were too close to the world. They lived too much by the world standards. They weren't at odds with the world. Therefore, they have conflict with Paul and judging Paul based on the standards of the world. We've talked about that a lot in this class. One of the great themes of Corinth is Paul trying to get them to stop judging spiritual things by worldly standards. So in other words, they were too assimilated in the world, and assimilation with the world avoids persecution. In contrast, the churches of Macedonia were not assimilated with the world. They stood for Christ in opposition and in contrast to the world. And as a result, they were suffering affliction and poverty. And Paul says, out of their affliction, their abundance of joy. Now think about Paul's letter to the Philippian church, which, by the way, hasn't been written yet at this moment. What is a great theme of the book of Philippians, if you just said one word? Joy. He writes to them about his overwhelming joy in spite of his imprisonment, in spite of all the things he's been inflicted with. He says, I am overflowing with joy. And he says about these churches of Macedonia, their abundance of joy in the face of persecution, in the face of affliction, and is overflowing. Either deep poverty is overflowing their wealth of liberality. So, to some extent, either subtly or maybe perhaps not so subtly, Paul is saying to these Corinthians, look, these persecuted, afflicted, poor churches have overwhelmingly supported this work and have finished it. You are wealthy and living in the lap of luxury. What are you going to do? And so, as we've said often, as we look at ourselves in the context of these chapters, we are far more like Corinth than we are like Philippi as a culture, as a world, or with the world around us and the struggles that we face. Not only all of that, but it says they were begging us with much urging the favor of participating in the support of the saints. Not only this, not as we expected, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. Now, that's going to become important in just a moment. But he says here, this was their urging. They wanted to pursue this. They asked us, they begged us, let us help. Let us do something. That's the opposite of you see something and you just kind of turn this way. I don't want to see it. I don't want to be asked anything. They are running to the work. They are running and begging to participate in it. And so Paul says, we urge Titus that as he had previously made at the beginning, Titus was involved in the Corinthians in their first beginning this work. He says, we've urged Titus as he had previously made a beginning, so he would complete in you this gracious work as well. So that's the subject. That's, in a sense, the introduction of the subject of these two chapters. Paul says, complete this work. Look to the Macedonians who had first been inspired by you. Now you be inspired by them and complete this work. So he says, just as you abound in everything in faith and in utterances and knowledge. And what is he referring to there? You abound in everything in faith and utterance and knowledge. There he is talking about the spiritual gifts that Corinth was so known for. When you read 1 Corinthians, one of the great topics in that letter is their relationship to spiritual gifts and their attitudes about spiritual gifts and their usage of spiritual gifts and how they use them in the church. Sometimes correctly, sometimes incorrectly. And he says, you abound in all of those things, but see to it that you abound in this. He says, and in all earnestness and in the love we inspired in you. And you can't help but read that and think, as Paul is writing in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that great chapter on love, what is Paul really writing about in chapter 13? As he's describing love. What is the point of that? The point of that is that love is greater than all your gifts. Remember how he begins that chapter? Though I speak with the tongues of angels, if I have not love, I'm just a sounding brass. His point is, love is the most important thing. And he concludes that chapter with, these things abide, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love, right? So here he says, just as you abound in everything, in faith and utterances and knowledge and in earnestness, and in the love we inspired in you, the love that Paul had inspired in them, both in his letter and in his actions among them, he says, see that you abound in this gracious work also. He says, I am not speaking this as a command, but as proving through the earnestness of others. So he's commented on their earnestness in chapter 7 where we began. Talked about their earnestness that had come as a result of their godly sorrow, right? And now he has spoken of the earnestness of the church in churches of Macedonia, their earnestness in verse 7. He says, I'm speaking this command, but proving through the earnestness of others. That is, now he's pointing to the earnestness of the churches. He says, that is now the standard by which I'm judging you. By that standard, we're going to judge the sincerity of your love. That's how he ends verse 8. The sincerity of your love, the standard for measuring that has been established by the churches of Macedonia and their earnestness for this work. We're still going to come back to the word earnest. So he is encouraging them to match the earnestness of the churches of Macedonia, and that would show the sincerity of their love in this matter and in all things. Now he gives a standard here, another standard here. The churches of Macedonia aren't the real standard, except that they reflect what is the real standard, which he says in verse 9, he says, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. Now think about that. Make a note to yourself to go read Philippians chapter 2, where it describes Jesus as being in heaven, thought not equality with God a thing to be grasped or held on to, but became a man, taking on the form of a man, and become obedient unto death, even death on the cross, bringing us our salvation. You can't get richer than God. You can't get richer than equal with God sitting in heaven on the throne of God. You can't get richer than that, yet he gave up all of that for what? To die, to be beaten, falsely accused, murdered. And Paul says he did that for you. So, rich to poor, the example is Christ. That's a powerful message to wealthy people, whom the Corinthians, generally speaking, were. Because if you're thinking about this, look to Christ. If you're seeking your motivation, look to Christ. He was rich, but for your sake, he became poor. I give my opinion in this matter, for this is to your advantage. You were the first to begin a year ago, not only to do this, but also to desire to do it. You were the first ones who wanted to do this. You're the first ones who talked about it and expressed your desire to do it, but now finish doing it also, so that just as there was the readiness to desire it, there may also be the completion of it by your ability. For if readiness is present, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. Now, think about that combined with his statements already about the Macedonian churches, who out of their affliction and abundance of joy and out of their poverty, their liberality sprang forth. And now he says, he says, according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. And what kept coming to my mind in this passage is the example of Jesus. Jesus gave us two examples. He gave more than two, but two that come to my mind related to this are on opposite ends of the spectrum. One was the rich young ruler who was wealthy, lived righteously, knew the law. And Jesus says, one thing you lack, go and sell all that you have and give to the poor. And that young man whom Jesus loved went away sorrowful. What is the other great example? The good example that Jesus gives. I'm sorry? The widow of Nain. So we have this other example that Jesus gives us of the widow who had one mite, and she cast it into the treasury. And what did the men think? They didn't think much of that mite, did they? And Jesus explains to them that she gave more than all of them, because she gave all that she had. She gave everything. So you see, it's not the amount. It's not the amount, but it is the intention, the heart that is behind it. It is the earnestness that is behind the gift, the earnestness. And so here he says, Paul says, according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. He says, this is not for the case of others and for your affliction, but by way of equality, that at this present time your abundance being a supply to their need, so that their abundance may become a supply for your need. That there may be equality. Now, the part of that verse I want you to pay attention to, he says, your abundance will supply their need, and their abundance will supply your need. What was the need of the Corinthians? They're the one doing the giving. They're giving everything to these saints in Judea. They're going to make this contribution. But Paul says that the Judeans might provide your need. And their need is the result of this work and the impact it will have on their heart and the humility and love that will be reflected in it will be their need. There's a great reference here to Exodus chapter 16 and the manna. We don't have time to talk about that. We're going to skip that. He says, now we come to verse 16. He says, but thanks be to God who puts the same earnestness on your behalf in the heart of Titus. So here's this word earnest again. This earnestness. He says, thanks be to God who has given Titus this earnestness on your behalf. And then he goes on, we're going to kind of skip over much of the rest of this chapter, but he goes on and he describes two men that are going to be sent with Titus to Corinth. They're not named, but apparently they were highly regarded, well thought of, but we're not told their name. But what we do know is that they were
Experience an incredible selection of the latest equipment, clothing, shoes, and accessories, plus a dedicated team of certified fitters and instructors.
You go back to chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians, when we said, choose from among yourselves, select men that will go and take this money to Jerusalem. These two, it seems, were those selected by the churches to travel with Titus to Corinth and then on to Judea with the gift. And he describes these men in verse 22 as he's describing the second one. He says, we have sent them with our brother whom we have tested and found diligent. This word diligent here is the same word as the word earnest. The same word, translated differently here. It's the same word. We have found him earnest in many things, and now more earnest, more diligent. And that's just the same word with an adverb compounded with it to say even more diligent. And that's the same thing we see in verse 17 where it says, talking of Titus, he says, not only he accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he has gone to you of his own accord. And now this third person that Paul is saying is coming to you, we have found him to be earnest. In fact, he is very earnest in these things. And so he asks them, accept Titus, his fellow worker, and these brethren, they are messengers of the churches, verse 23, a glory to Christ. Therefore, openly before the churches, show them the proof of your love and the reason for our boasting for you. So I want to talk for a few moments about this word earnest. If we don't get to the rest of this, that's fine, but I definitely want to make sure that we talk about this. The word earnest here is the Greek word spude. I'm skipping ahead. Give me a moment to find my place here. This Greek word spude. What's interesting, as you know, you have Greek words. The New Testament's written in Greek, and sometimes those Greek words don't have the perfect equivalent in English. And so we try to figure out what English word that people in the day we're translating it understand to mean what this Greek. The whole idea of translations is to help us understand what the Greek word said, right? That's why there's pros and cons to paraphrase translations and all that. There's an effort to say, hey, we want you to understand what this Greek word meant, but sometimes there's a lot of liberality taken in that and license taken in that, and you end up even further from it. But over time, English words kind of lose their significance or change their meaning. We could give you a long list of English words that 100 years ago meant something very different than they mean today because of how we use them. When's the last time you used the word earnest in a conversation? Probably been a while. Maybe never. He's very earnest. I think the general sense of that is we get the idea that earnest means sincere. That's to me, if somebody says he's very earnest, I think that means he's sincere. But what I want to do is help you understand what the Greek word spude, what it meant in earnest. And there's a couple of ways we can do that. One part of this word, one sense of the meaning of this word is the idea of hurry, hasten. In Luke chapter 1 and verse 39, if you'll recall, Mary finds out she's pregnant. She hasn't been with a man, but I'm pregnant. Do you remember what she did? She went to see her cousin, Elizabeth. And in chapter 1 and verse 39, the word spude is there, and it says, and she hurried to the mountains to see Elizabeth. She hurried. In Mark chapter 6 and verse 25, we see the word again. This word isn't in the New Testament a lot, but we find it again in Mark, the only 2 times it's in the Gospels, and there it's talking about the daughter of Herodias. After speaking with her mother, and her mother says, get John the Baptist. And we're told that the daughter hurried to Herod to ask for the head of John the Baptist, and it's the word spude. She hurried to go tell him. Now, the idea behind both uses of this word hurried in these 2 cases is excitement. You're excited about something. One case, you're excited about something good, maybe a little terrifying in the case of Mary. On the other hand, you're excited about something evil. But in both cases, they're excited and they're hurrying. Another way to kind of help understand this word, look over in Romans chapter 12. In Romans chapter 12, if you recall, this very famous chapter where Paul is describing the transformation of the Christian that he spoke of in verse 2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. And then he goes through a long, beautiful passage where he is describing the life of a Christian transformed into the image of Christ. And he says in verse 11, well, let's begin in verse 10. He says, be devoted to one another in brotherly love, give preference to one another in honor. And then verse 11, he says, not lagging behind in diligence. The word diligence here, like we saw in the latter part of chapter 8 in 2 Corinthians, where it was translated diligence. This is again the word spude. He says, not lagging behind in diligence. And then he gives a contrasting statement to that. Don't be lagging. When you're lagging behind, what does that refer to? You know, teachers can relate to this. You got a line of kids going down the hall, and you're leading them, and you turn around and look, and there's one 50 yards back there. He's lagging behind. He's dilly-dallying. He says, don't be lagging behind in diligence, in earnestness, in spude. Don't be, and the contrasting statement is, be fervent in spirit. Now, the word fervent here is the word zeo, which is a Greek word that referred to the boiling of water. Fervent in spirit. Be fervent in spirit. And then the last contrast we'll hear, and we'll have to hurry on here so we can actually make a point, is Hebrews chapter 6. In Hebrews chapter 6, we find this word again. And again, there's a contrasting statement that tells us something. In Hebrews chapter 6, I want to say it's verse 11 here. Maybe I got the wrong notation. Yeah, chapter 6, verses 11 and 12. I was looking too far down. Here we go. Chapter 6, he says, and we desire each one of you show the same diligence. Again, that's our word. Earnestness, diligence, spoude. So as to realize the full assurance of hope until the end, so that you, here's our contrasting statement, so that you will not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. So back to our word here, our usage of the word here in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Paul is saying to them, you have to desire this. And you have to desire it earnestly. And I thought, we don't use the word earnest. What word do we use? It conveys all of these things. And it suddenly hit me. It's the word eager. If I said, so-and-so wants to do this, you say, oh, this person wants to do this. But if I say, so-and-so is eager, what do we know? They're anxious. They're in a hurry. They're going to prioritize it. They're not going to procrastinate about it. They're not going to put it off. They're not going to avoid it. They're not going to do it begrudgingly. They're eager to do it. And so what Paul is saying to these brethren is, you got to be eager for this work. So we're gonna conclude that thought as part of as we move on next week. We're going to come back to this thought. So hold on to that thought, because I want to talk about how do you fake eager? You can't fake eager. So you have to actually be genuinely eager. And we'll talk about that as we begin next week. Thank you.